Recently, I finally watched The Mandalorian, the Disney Plus show taking place in the Star Wars universe. I did not watch it when it aired, because I was busy with my book, which is about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so I had no mind for other universes. Another reason was that the last trilogy was so awful that it turned me off Star Wars, and I didn't care about the show. But I heard good things about it, and now that I watched it, I realize that it does Star Wars right, after the wrong that has been done to it by the last movies. So I thought we should look into why The Mandalorian works where they did not. And I will do my best not to spoil anything, because I want you to go watch the show. First of all, there's the fact that the art of television is now superior to the art of cinema. We shall discuss later why that is, but now let's ask what makes The Mandalorian such a good TV show. Well, one answer is that it invokes TV classics, something that Disney Plus seems to be doing very well. Their other hit show, WandaVision, drew beautifully from the history of TV sitcoms, and cleverly worked it all into the thematic logic of the story. The Mandalorian draws from vigilante hero shows, especially The Lone Ranger. Just like in that show, we have a masked hero who travels in a lawless world. For the Lone Ranger it was the prairie of the Wild West, for the Mandalorian it is the outer rim of the post-Imperial Republic. Every episode represents a new adventure, in which he helps someone in need and then moves on. At least, that's how it started out. But then, unlike the Lone Ranger and other classic vigilante shows, longer story arcs started to take over the show. This is where the art of television progressed compared to the first decades of the medium. There used to be two basic formats of TV shows. Most shows had a regular cast of characters that would play out a certain situation. The situation would end by the end of the episode, and in the next week the same cast would be back for a brand new story. The characters would remain essentially the same, showing very little change and growth. The other format was a soap opera, which was one long saga. They had long story arcs, and could thus discuss deeper issues. But their production value was low, and it limited their artistic expression. Starting from the 90s, more money was poured into television, and the soap opera format took over, with many shows now telling one never-ending tale containing long story arcs. But the even better format is the hybrid, in which it is a never-ending story, but every episode also has its own mini-story. The Mandalorian is such a show. But The Mandalorian also has an advantage over most other shows. It operates within an established pop universe, with its own mythology. The show started out with a cast of characters we never met before, and it seemed to be simply the Lone Ranger within the Star Wars universe. This was interesting enough, but once they started to work longer arcs into it, the mythology started to weave its strands into the show, and familiar characters started to cross paths with our hero. As we follow the adventures of Mando, we take a trip down memory lane, and meet beloved friends. Some cynical naysayers dismiss it as fan service, to which many fans angrily reply, why should we not be serviced? So let's discuss this, and figure out when fan service is good and when it is bad. And we shall use The Mandalorian as an example for the former, and the last film trilogy as an example for the latter. From here on, I'm going to refer to it as the trilogy. So remember that when I say trilogy, I am not talking about the trilogy, but about the sequels. When we talk about storytelling, and this is also true for art in general, we are talking about a form of communication. There are three relevant parts to this communication. There is the storyteller, there is the audience, and there's the story. A good storyteller must serve all three to create a good story. First, they must serve themselves. They have a story to tell, a message to convey, a personal vision. They must remain true to that vision, and not change it in order to appeal to anyone in the audience. But the story also takes a life of its own, and the storyteller must be faithful to it as well. The story and the characters must follow and grow organically from the original premise, and from the directions they took before. Straying away from it for some reason does disservice to the story, and is bad storytelling. Finally, there is the audience, and it too must be served. The story must be told in a way that interests them, moves them, thrills them, inspires them, and makes them think. When it is a story within an established mythology that already has fans, the storyteller must be aware of the spirit of the community, to know how to best serve it. When you create with this community in mind, you are providing fan service. But it is bad fan service only if you are not faithful to the other two parts, if you do it while giving up on your personal vision or not being faithful to the established story. The trilogy failed on all three counts, and each film can be used as an example for one of them. The first movie, The Force Awakens, fails to provide a personal vision. It feels like a copycat of A New Hope, as if the creators knew that the fans loved that movie, so they served them by giving them more of the same. The new characters also mostly feel like they were made in the mold of the old characters. Still, it did have the character of Finn, who was something that we haven't seen before, and it did contain some intriguing questions, which I thought would develop into a story with its own vision. So I enjoyed the film and thought it had potential. With hindsight, however, none of the questions led to anything interesting, and nothing was done with Finn. So now I find myself completely uninterested in watching The Force Awakens again. The second movie, The Last Jedi, actually does have a vision, but it fails to grow organically from what came before, and thus fails the story. The questions and themes set up in the first movie are cast aside in favor of new themes. Worse, it presents new abilities that do not follow from what was previously established. The overall message of Star Wars is subverted, and the old beloved characters are minimized and humiliated. It feels like they are there just for fan service. The fans want to see Admiral Ackbar? Alright, we will give them Ackbar, but not give him anything significant to do. The fans want to see a reunion between Luke and Chewie? Alright, we will give them that, but without showing any meaningful interaction between them. This is not how you write a story. We care about these old characters. They are part of us, and thus have the ability to move us. When something is added to the story, we want it to be deep and significant. The Last Jedi gave us almost none of that, as if the old characters are there just as background for the new characters. Then came The Rise of Skywalker, which showed how not to tell a story. Everything in it feels like an attempt to serve the fans things that will move and excite them, but there is no real commitment and thought behind it, so it ends up being just a series of cheap thrills. A lot of exciting stuff happens, but it feels like stuff just happens, with no coherency or logic. There are sad moments when we are made to believe that something bad happened to one of our heroes, but 5 minutes later we find out that they are alright. I came out of the movie feeling nothing. The whole trilogy is just one long train wreck. Then there's The Mandalorian. Like the trilogy, it begins by introducing heroes we never met before, but does it in a way that grows out of the mythology and immediately adds another dimension to it. We mostly focus on two groups that were the antagonists in the movies, the bounty hunters and the stormtroopers. We get to see things from their perspective, and it deepens our understanding of their relation with the Jedi and the Republic. So when we finally meet some old heroes, they come into a story that is a new original vision of the mythology, but also a story in which they are already integral characters. They are depicted in a way that is faithful to their previous depictions, but they also have completely new grounds to play in, and it adds more layers to their character and lore. Most importantly, this allows the creators to drop them into the scene at well-timed moments, which surprise you yet make sense, and give the fans some of the most memorable thrills they ever experienced.
I don't know why I'm crying. This is like everything that I ever wanted from the sequels.
Now let's go back to something we said earlier, about television being a superior art form to cinema right now. Why is that? What made the creative forces move to the small screen? This is a question that I already dealt with in previous videos, so I'll give the short version. A movie tells just one story, and this is a format that was good for what we call the modern age. The modern age, as I and others define it, lasted from the late 18th century to the mid-1960s. It was typified by the idea of progress, in which humanity goes through a process of maturation until it achieves its full potential, and will be able to devise a perfect global society. A modern story treated every character as a different facet of humanity, and played those facets against each other in order to find a resolution that will advance humanity forward. Cinema was a good medium for this type of story, better than TV that had less time to develop them. As you know, I, uniquely, claim that we are now living in the pop age, which began in the mid-1910s. In the pop age, we are no longer trying to create a perfect world, but rather learning to enjoy this world that modern progress has created. I divide this age into 3 periods. Right now we are living in the cyber period, which began in the mid-1990s. This period came about after we have already completely freed ourselves of the modern narrative, and we no longer want the type of stories that I described. Instead, we want unique stories, with characters that are not symbolic facets of a universal humanity but stand on their own, each with their own eccentricities. We don't want to be told the same old story, but to be surprised. And the stories don't lead to an enlightened resolution but represent life, and because of that, they can be never-ending, and contain many subplots. Television is the best medium to tell this type of story, and that is why it is now ascendant. Now, we said that this mindset begins in the mid-90s, whereas the modern age ended in the mid-60s. What was the type of story that was told in the interim? Well, this is the period that I call the rock and roll period, lasting from the mid-50s to the mid-2000s. One of the things that typified this period is that the youth became the main driving force of culture. In the modern age, people were working for the future, and that gave meaning to their life. But once they no longer believed in the utopian future, they were basically just working to achieve a comfortable bourgeois existence.
Once my kids leave the house, I'll finally be able to do what every man is supposed to do. I can watch TV. I can... Well, I don't know, but it doesn't matter.
For the youth, it seemed like they have just a few short years to do something exciting with their life, before they are relegated to the boring routine of work and family, in which they will be confined to a small circle of friends and relatives. Thus, the youth formed a culture of its own, in which ways of a more exciting existence were sought out. This lasted throughout the rock and roll period. Every 3-4 years, there would be a new generation of teenagers that would define its own values, usually through music, and the previous generations would be considered boring old has-beens. Pop culture thus started to cater to the youth, and in Hollywood cinema, it meant that the heroes of adventure films were usually young people, often teenagers. The adults in these movies were usually clueless, and the kids had to go it alone on an adventure and solve things on their own. The cyber period begins with the rise of the World Wide Web, which changed this picture. Now, being a middle-aged family man doesn't mean that you are detached from pop culture and confined to your own small circle. Through the internet and social media, we can all participate in culture. Adventure movies are now made for all ages, and can feature adult heroes as well. And when they are put together, adult characters are more interesting than teenagers. Let's take Spider-Man as an example. When Stan Lee wanted to introduce the character at the beginning of the rock and roll period, he was vetoed by Marvel publisher Martin Goodman, who claimed that no one would be interested in a teenage superhero. But Lee sensed the changing of the times, and once he managed to sneak the character in, Spidey became a sensation and a staple of the period. But comic books as a whole were belittled during the rock and roll period, so he never made it to film until the period ended. The Tobey Maguire films were made in the transitional phase between the rock and roll and cyber periods, so they already contained some characteristics of the cyber period, like taking the comic book world seriously, but our teenaged hero is still living in a world of youth, in which the adults play very little part in helping him fight crime. The Tom Holland films, on the other hand, are made in the cyber period. Here, Spidey is surrounded by adult characters that are wiser and more interesting than him, and he tries to fit into their world. It is a new period, but the creators of the Star Wars films failed to realize it. The original trilogy is a product of the rock and roll period. The main protagonists, Luke and Leia, are teenagers when the story begins, and Han is also very young. They have some older characters that help them, but they essentially fight the battle on their own. The prequels were made in the transitional phase, so the story still revolves around young Anakin and Padme, but there are also older protagonists, who are wiser and more interesting. The sequel trilogy, made in the cyber period, should have focused on the adult characters. Instead, it went back to young, uninteresting heroes, while the older characters were marginalized. Yet another fail. In contrast, the Mandalorian cast is made of all seasoned warriors. The youngest actor on the regular cast is 38-year-old Gina Carano, and she is no longer part of the cast. She was deemed too young and stupid to be on the show. There is one character that is called the Child, but he is portrayed as someone who needs to be taken care of by the adults. All the characters are thus complex and interesting, carrying a long history behind them. This is how it should be done in today's pop culture. The trilogy is also behind the times in another way. The modern age was the time when literature started to be considered an art form. Before that, books were usually flights of fancy, taking the reader on a fantastic adventure through an imaginary realm. In the modern age, since the ideal became the progress of man through history, the real world became the biggest adventure of all. This brought the rise of the realistic novel, which dwelled in contemporary reality and explored psychological, social, and political issues. These types of novels became known as fine literature, while those who were not realistic were branded fantasy literature, and denigrated as nothing more than escapism for children. Once the modern age ended, however, fine literature lost its power, and another genre took over in the rock and roll period. Since we no longer knew what future we were headed to, science fiction now became the most creative and interesting form of literature, offering speculations about possible futures and alternative worlds. However, there was still a demand for some realism. The sci-fi books and films that were celebrated were those that had some sort of connection to our reality, and could thus offer a different perspective. Literature of pure fantasy was still disparaged. The original Star Wars trilogy was a big step in changing this attitude, telling a fairy tale about a galaxy far, far away that nevertheless became hugely popular. But it was appreciated mainly for its special effects and real-world metaphors. Those who were completely engrossed in the fantasy were ridiculed as weirdo geeks. That, until the rock and roll period practically solved the last remaining big problems of Western society, and the real world became boring. We are beginning to think of the real world as more like a launchpad to many other worlds. In the cyber period, people started to form communities based on their favorite pop mythologies, and expanded them into vast universes in which they could dwell, at least in spirit. We now want art that tells stories within these universes, and so, fantasy literature became the leading form of literature, and fantasy universes, like the Star Wars universe, became the places we want to dwell in. This is why the sequel trilogy felt so impoverished. No civilization and no non-human creatures were added to the canon in any significant way. The Force Awakens introduced the alien characters Snoke and Maz Kanata, and the android BB-8, but they were not developed in the succeeding films. The Last Jedi, in particular, felt like it was using the alien worlds as metaphors for America, instead of giving us a fantasy alternative. All the alien creatures in this film were non-speaking animals that were there just to sell toys. I reacted at the time by making a video called The Last Jedi is Racist, a clickbaity title that was meant to be tongue-in-cheek, but I later regretted doing that. I don't like throwing the term racist around, I did it because I was pissed off at the creators calling everyone criticizing the film a bigot, so I wanted to show them how easy it is to do and give them a taste of their own medicine. I should have refrained from it. Still, there was something that felt really insulting about The Last Jedi, and The Mandalorian helped me realize what it was. In The Mandalorian, we meet a lot of non-human creatures, and get to know their personalities. Moreover, many of these creatures belong to species or droid types we've met before, and it feels like meeting old friends. The child, the young hero who represents hope for the future, is not human, and somehow that makes him even more interesting than Luke, Anakin, and Rey, who held this capacity in the films. This is what we want from fantasy. We want to be whisked away into another universe with different creatures, and we form emotional attachment to these imaginary creatures. We actually care about them. So when The Last Jedi reduced the Star Wars universe to only humans, it truly felt like a supremacist piece, like an attempt to purify society from strangers. The other two films didn't do much better, and the trilogy left a bad taste. The Mandalorian feels like breaking out of this xenophobia into a more liberal and pluralistic environment, which expands our world and our spirit. Then there's the way in which women are depicted. The trilogy was made in the height of the woke craze, and the biggest harm was done to the representation of female characters. Unfortunately, the social justice movement is still stuck in old modernist notions. They believe that utopia is possible, and the only reason it doesn't prevail is that most of us are trapped in a false consciousness and don't know what's good for us. We must therefore be woken from this spell, stop believing in our current values, and adopt the social justice values. Once we are all woke, equality and harmony will naturally manifest. This moronic attitude led to the idea that women representation in media should be stripped away of many feminine traits, because those traits are supposedly designed to keep women subordinate. And so female characters in movies were left with very little character traits that were deemed acceptable by the woke crowd. The women in the trilogy are basically Mary Sues, who have no dark sides or character flaws, and can do everything by themselves without ever relying on men for anything. They are boring and bland. Again, The Last Jedi is the most egregious of the three. The whole Admiral Holdo subplot seemed to be aimed at getting us woke. Her actions seem bizarre at first, so we are driven to believe that she is a bad leader. Our young heroes rebel and try to win the battle in a different way, but it leads nowhere, and it turns out that Holdo actually did have a plan. It feels like the creators are trying to wake us up to the realization that traits like individualism, courage, initiative, and rebelliousness, commonly associated with masculinity, are bad traits, and instead we should listen and believe women. But that's not how art works, and all it does is make a big chunk of the film feel pointless, while also adding another terrible female character to the roster. In contrast, the female characters in The Mandalorian all have real and complicated personalities. Same goes for WandaVision, and the two hit Disney Plus series of the last year might be signaling that Hollywood is finally waking up from the woke phase. The show The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, currently running, deals with the issue of race relations, a hot topic in America at the moment. The woke approach is to claim that the entire American system is designed to maintain the domination of the white man. Any progress is just window dressing, and the country remains as white supremacist as ever. Thankfully, this is not what we see on the show. The racism of the past is reflected in one of the characters, and it is an awful story. Understandably, he doesn't believe things changed. But we see a more complicated picture. We see that things are much better today, but still, our black hero Falcon runs into all sorts of problems due to his skin color, problems that might be invisible to those of us who aren't African American, meaning that the situation may be better, but still worse than we might think. This is one way that art actually can make you more aware, not by treating you as someone who has false consciousness and must be awakened to see the truth, but by treating you as someone who is conscious and conscientious, someone who can gain a better understanding of reality by experiencing the types of problems that others face. Some angry Star Wars fans commented after The Last Jedi that they come to these movies to escape from contemporary politics, and didn't need to see them on screen. I don't think that's accurate. Fantasy universes like Star Wars do deal with political questions, but they deal with them on a more philosophical level, from which you can then extrapolate to your own world. The Mandalorian doesn't feel like it is trying to invoke today's social and political struggles, and yet, it makes you ponder on some questions that are very relevant to the problems we face today. One of them is that it takes place right after the fall of the dictatorial empire, and we see that freedom isn't all wine and roses. In the corner of the galaxy that our heroes move in, it has led to anarchy and to the rise of local warlords and criminals. In today's world, when a lot of people seem to be disenchanted by democracy, it is a good way to approach the issue. Or consider this scene.
I was on the Death Star.
Which one?
You think you're funny? Do you know how many millions were killed on those bases?
Drop your blaster.
As the galaxy cheered.
I believe this is the first time, within the Star Wars universe, that we encounter the question of the morality of killing all those people on the Death Stars. This made one YouTube commentator, in particular, very happy.
Now, number one, as the guy, who wrote the scene in Clerks about fucking innocent Death Star contractors getting killed, we're in my era of Star Wars now, Mark, where people are asking the important questions, questions that I've been waiting a quarter of a century to get answers to and shit like that.
Kevin Smith is of course referring to this scene from Clerks, his debut movie, which he made back in 1994.
Now, the first one was completed and fully operational before the Rebels destroyed it.
Luke blew it up. Give credit where credit's due.
And the second one was still being built when they blew it up.
Compliments of Lando Calrissian.
Something just never sat right with me that second time around. I could never put my finger on it, but something just wasn't right.
And you figured it out.
The first Death Star was manned by the Imperial Army. The only people on board were stormtroopers, dignitaries, Imperials.
Basically.
So when they blew it up, no problem. Evil's punished.
And the second time around?
The second time around, it wasn't even done being built yet. It was still under construction.
So
a construction job of that magnitude would require a hell of a lot more manpower than the Imperial Army had to offer. I bet they brought independent contractors in on that thing. Plumbers, aluminum siders, roofers.
Not just Imperials, is that what you're getting at?
Exactly. In order to get it built quickly and quietly, they'd hire anybody that can do the job. Think the average stormtrooper knows how to install a toilet main? All they know is killing in white uniforms.
Alright, so they bring in independent contractors. Why are you so upset at its destruction?
All those innocent contractors brought in to do the job were killed. Casualties of a war they had nothing to do with. Alright, look. You're a roofer. Some juicy government contract comes your way. You got a wife and kids, the two-story in suburbia. This is a government contract, which means all sorts of benefits. Along come these left-wing militants and blast everything within a 3-mile radius with their lasers. You didn't ask for that. You have no personal politics. You're just trying to scrape out a living.
This scene shows the kind of ethical discussions that pop universes can generate, even when they take place in a galaxy far, far away. The pop culture of the past tending to shy away from the question of the morality of killing innocent people in war. It was usually somehow arranged that the heroes never killed anyone innocent. But that is not realistic, and the pop stories of the cyber period dare to go into these questions. Asking these questions can be risky business. There's a similar discussion in the Talmud. The Jewish rabbis noticed a problem with the Exodus story. We are told that God warned the Egyptians that he is going to shower them with hail so big that it will kill all their farm animals. Those Egyptians who feared God took their animals into shelter, while those who didn't lost all their livestock. Later, we are told that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians chased the Israelites on their horses, until God drowned them in the Red Sea. Now, since only those who feared God had horses left, it means that God ended up killing the good Egyptians, and the rabbis wondered about the morality of this act. Their conclusion was that when fighting a war against the Gentiles, it is morally legitimate to kill even the best of them. And this conclusion has been used by anti-Semites throughout the ages, who take it out of context and claim that the Talmud says that even the best of Gentiles deserves to die. This is the type of slander you open yourself to when you deal honestly with such questions. Today, too, there are those virtue signalers who will attack you when you suggest killing during war is justified. They never offer a better solution, of course. They just sit on the sidelines and criticize those who try honestly to deal with complicated issues, to get a sense of moral superiority over them. However, this just shows their moral depravity. If you refuse to join the fight and get your hands dirty, as Luke Skywalker does in The Last Jedi, you allow evil to reign. And if you do join the fight, you better be prepared to answer those tough moral questions, and you better use the time of peace to ponder on them, so you will be prepared once war comes. So virtue signalers are helping evil win, and you should have the courage to resist them. It is not easy though. They might drag your name through the mud and ruin your life. This is where art comes in handy. In art, you can deal with those questions while relegating them to another galaxy. The trilogy largely ran away from tough questions. The Mandalorian raises them. Now, if you want a work of art that isn't afraid to deal with such questions, I once again recommend my book. It also expands on other points I made in this video. And watch The Mandalorian, too. It's good.